It's September 23rd, and we're continuing with Steve Delia's interviews of poets. Today, Steve's guest is teacher, poetry connoisseur, and poet himself, Ray Greenblatt.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for doing this.
It's good to be here, Steve.
And I will do what I always do at the very beginning of these interviews, ask for a little background, how you became interested in poetry, what your early influences were.
I'm trying to think of influences. They almost go back to the very beginning. My mother read to me when I was a very small child, and I kept up reading. The word became all important to me. My father was a jazz musician, so we had music in the home from a very early age. And I can remember classical music, even though he played jazz, you always had old 78s of Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, Debussy. So that sense of rhythm was in my soul, and the word was always there. So those two things were, I think, important channels.
You think the rhythm of the music was naturally embedded in your poetry?
Definitely. Yeah.
And when you said your mother read to you, are we talking strictly poetry, or did she read all kinds of things?
Mostly adventure stuff, mostly novels.
Novels, okay.
And by the time I got to reading on my own, I must have read 50 Oz books. Now you say to yourself, L. Frank Baum only wrote about a dozen on his own, but after he died, his daughter carried on writing several, and then they sold the copyright, and people kept writing Oz books, and I loved them all, because they still dealt with the same land, they dealt with the same characters, and brought new characters in all the time. So it was fascinating to me. And that stimulated my imagination early on.
And when did the actual poetry really started to take shape and, I would guess, become dominant in what you were doing?
Long time. I started out with prose. As a matter of fact, in fourth grade in school, I won a short story contest. And was thrilled by that. But didn't write anything else except what you had to do in school, mostly essays. And then I was in my sophomore year in college, working on a school magazine, and I had written some essays, and I had written some travelogues, and I guess I used a good dollop of imagery. And the editor, who was a very perspicacious guy, he was a very cool guy, he said, "Have you ever tried writing poetry?" And I said, "No." And I went home and started looking around the house for a prop. And I came across, I can still remember, it was my first poem, I came across my mother's jewel box with a carving in the top of it of a bunch of 18th century English house and a bunch of riders in their proper attire with their beautiful horses and 40 hound dogs about to go chase the fox. And I thought, I could describe that box and then I can make up the rest. I'll go into that box and pretend it's a box of letters and postcards from friends of mine. So it became a two-part poem. I juxtaposed parts of the box as the poem went on against parts of the letters and then try to draw them together. So to me, for very first poem, it was very successful, and I think that's what got me going.
And it's interesting that you're talking about drawing up these stories and things from imagination, but you also said you did some essays. So essays would be the complete opposite. You were probably writing topical things.
Yeah, like a trip to Canada. Right. With a friend of mine, we went camping.
So you already had the balance thing going of writing the true and the untrue.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't come easy for all of us.
Another important influence was I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. But in those days, suburbia was right on the edge of nature. And where we were, they were building some houses, but at the end of the street, there was a field. And a bull lived in that field. It was Mrs. Valentine's field. And we as little kids used to dare each other to run across that field before the bull saw us. And then next door...
How did your parents feel about that?
We never told them that. I knew a rich kid that lived farther away in this huge country house, and we used to go out on his roof and walk around. I mean, if my parents knew about these things, God forbid. But that was part of the thrill of adventuring. We lived next to a house where the mother was young and taking care of 2 young kids. The father was away making a lot of money, and they had this wonderful dog named Zipper. She was a wire hair, looked just like Asta. Remember the thin man, Nick and Nora Charles? And they were glad that I babysat their dog, so Zipper was the name of the dog. We used to go out into the woods all the time, every day when I got home from school. So that element of nature was there too. I'd come across all kinds of things, a dead bird or a certain kind of tree. In the autumn, bright leaves changing and so on. So all those things I think impacted me. So I always had that love of nature too.
Yeah, the question that was kind of brewing up in my mind, you practically already answered. I was going to ask you, how much do you think your background and where you've lived and grew up, how do you think that, not just you personally, but how do you think that affects poets? Do you think that that's a dominant thing in poets writing?
I think that's our material that we grew up with. Now some of us, I call my childhood very happy. I was a single child, an only child, but I had fulfilling things to do. And my parents were always respectful of my place. I was not spoiled, I don't think. I was not isolated. There was a balance there. And they gave me enough freedom to do my thing and to grow up my own way. And I think that's very important. So I could only draw on the things that were around me. And I think probably where you grew up, you used the neighborhood. You knew what you saw on television, or what movies you went to, what music you heard. So I think we all do that. We've got to write about basically what we know, and then we can enlarge on that. Some of us lie more than others.
And as you started getting a little older, was your interest in poetry really quick, or was it kind of a slow
I think
development?
once I started to write in college, it stuck with me. Yeah. As far as giving readings or getting published, I had to put that on hold because I had a couple young kids, and that's a full-time job. So you're working, you're raising your kids, and then it was I was well into my 30s before I had my first reading and got published.
Where were you reading at in those days?
I can remember the first place was called the Fairmount. Do you know Fairmount? Near the
Well, I know
museum?
the area, but
Yeah, there was a restaurant there where readings were given. I think Ben Catan,
yeah, I know Ben.
remember Ben,
Yes.
who's no longer wittying with us? He had one of the earliest readings there, and I loved it. It was great. And then it went on from there. I mean, there were all kinds of things downtown. Often they disappear after a few months, right?
Yes.
We've been to many readings.
Yeah, venues seem to come and go very quick.
Right, right.
Now, I first met you when I became associated with the Mad Poets. Obviously, you had been a Mad Poets years before.
Mad for years. Right, right.
But how did you get involved with that? How did you discover the Mad Poets?
I don't know how I got with Delco. Again, I guess I was looking for a poetry connection, and this was pre-Eileen D'Angelo. We were in that lovely rose tree 18th century house. And Eileen was probably there as a member too, and then when this gal retired, I think Eileen stepped into the breach and took over.
Yeah, I believe that was Beth Phillips Brown was running that before.
In part. There was a man, there was another man too, and a woman who was connected with Delco, with the county of Delaware County. Forget what her name was, but she was retiring.
Were you part of that poetry crowd that where they used to
Walk with the torches.
with the moonlight?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was fun. That made it really original. And then once Eileen grabbed hold of it, she was wonderful because she opened up all these different venues in suburban areas, which we never had.
Yeah, kind of the same thing in the city too.
Yeah.
Mike and I used to talk all the time about we'd look so forward to Saturdays for our regular reading, and you were lucky if you could find another poetry reading in the same month.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they're all over.
And I didn't get into Philadelphia much at all, being a suburban kid. That came later.
Now, how do you feel about the venues right now? Do you like?
Oh, I think it's fantastic. Yeah, I think people have to keep experimenting, have to keep getting out there with the word. I really compliment some of these MCs that have been with it for years. I mean, presently, we have some good things going. When you think of Camille Nocella at the Regency,
Mm-hmm.
that is a wonderful
Yeah, hi, Camille.
venue. I mean, she has 40 and 50 people in there because the food's good, the music good, the poetry's good, and the vibes are good. So you've got everything going. And I hope she goes indefinitely.
I think you hit the key word, vibes. And for me personally, I go by the vibe of a place. If it has a good vibe, I want to go back. Those are the places I want to read.
And be very happy being part of the audience.
Yes.
Not necessarily showboating yourself. Yeah,
Yeah.
you get a freebie at the end, open mic.